At a charity gala filled with wealth and applause, Ethan Harper thought he was about to give another forgettable speech, until three 6-year-old girls with his eyes stepped in front of him and quietly destroyed everything he thought he knew about his life. The charity gala filled the grand ballroom with soft music, polite laughter, and the muted sparkle of wealth that no longer impressed Ethan Harper. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over marble floors, waiters moved silently between guests, and cameras flashed every few seconds, capturing smiles that were rehearsed and empty. Ethan stood near the edge of the room with a glass of untouched champagne in his hand, nodding automatically as donors congratulated him on another successful year. He was used to this world, comfortable in it, and completely detached from it. He had just finished a brief speech about hope, responsibility, and giving back when he felt an unexpected stillness behind him, as if the air itself had changed. Someone tugged gently at his jacket. He turned. In front of him stood three little girls. They were small, no more than 6 years old, standing shoulder to shoulder as if drawing courage from one another. They wore simple but elegant dark blue dresses, clearly chosen with care, and their brown hair was neatly braided in the same way, almost painfully identical. What struck him hardest were their eyes. Blue. The exact shade he saw every morning in the mirror. For a moment, Ethan thought his mind was playing a cruel trick on him. He blinked, once, then again. The girls didn't disappear. "What? I have children?" he asked, his voice low and unsteady, barely audible over the music. The words slipped out before he could stop them. He hadn't meant to say them aloud. The guests nearby fell silent, sensing something unusual. Ethan barely noticed. His attention was locked on the three faces staring up at him with a mixture of fear, hope, and exhaustion far beyond their years. One of the girls stepped forward. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was calm, rehearsed, as if she had practiced these words many times. "Our mom died," she said. Her name was Emma. The name hit him like a physical blow. The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor, but no one reacted. Ethan felt as though the room had narrowed, the walls pressing inward, leaving no space to breathe. Before he could respond, the girl reached into a small worn purse and pulled out a photograph. She held it up carefully, as if it were something sacred. Ethan recognized it instantly. He was younger in the picture, thinner, smiling in a way he hadn't smiled in years. His arm was wrapped around a woman with gentle eyes and an unmistakable curve to her belly. Emma. Alive. Radiant. Pregnant. His heart dropped so suddenly it felt like falling from a great height. "She said you were our father," another girl added quietly. "She said we should find you if anything ever happened to her." Ethan's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His mind raced, searching for logic, for denial, for any explanation that would make this moment unreal. Years of carefully controlled emotions cracked open all at once. "This isn't possible," he finally said, shaking his head. "She would have told me. She would have found me." The third girl, the smallest of the three, looked up at him with eyes far too serious for a child. "She tried," she said. "You just weren't there." Around them, the charity gala continued, unaware that a man who had built an empire in silence and solitude had just watched his entire world collapse and reform in the span of a single breath. Ethan left the gala early that night, something he had never done before. The reporters noticed, the donors whispered, and his assistant sent a dozen unanswered messages to his phone, but none of it mattered. The image of three identical blue eyes followed him out into the cold night, burned into his thoughts so deeply that even the city lights blurred as his driver pulled away from the building. He didn't go home. Instead, he sat alone in the back seat of the car, staring at the photograph the girls had given him, turning it over and over in his hands as if the truth might change depending on the angle. Emma's smile in the picture was soft and unguarded, the kind of smile she had only shown when she thought no one was watching. He remembered the night it had been taken, the cheap diner, the laughter, the promise that tomorrow would be better. He remembered how young and reckless he had been, how convinced he was that he had time. Emma Wilson. The name echoed through his memory, unlocking doors he had kept sealed for a decade. Back then, he wasn't a billionaire or a public figure. He was just a man with a failing startup, sleepless nights, and a constant fear of losing everything. Emma had been working double shifts as a waitress, studying at night, dreaming of a future she refused to believe was out of reach. She had challenged him, argued with him, believed in him when no one else did. Loving her had felt dangerous, because she saw through him too easily. Then everything collapsed. His business partner disappeared with their remaining funds, leaving Ethan on the edge of ruin. Lawsuits followed. Creditors circled. Panic consumed him, and instead of fighting, he ran. He told himself it was temporary, that once he rebuilt his life, he would come back for her. But weeks turned into months, and pride hardened into silence. He changed his number. He stopped checking his old email. He convinced himself that disappearing was an act of protection, not abandonment. Sitting in the dark car, Ethan finally opened his phone and searched her name. The results were brief and devastating. An obituary. Modest. Almost invisible. Emma Wilson, loving mother of 3 daughters, remembered for her kindness and quiet strength. Mother of 3. His chest tightened until it hurt to breathe. When he arrived at his penthouse, the space felt unbearably empty. The walls were clean, expensive, and lifeless, offering no comfort. He poured himself a drink and didn't touch it, then sank onto the couch with the photograph still clutched in his hand. He tried to calculate timelines, to find a flaw in the story, but every memory aligned too perfectly. The months. Her sudden silence. The way she had looked at him the last time they spoke, as if she wanted to say something and couldn't find the words. He remembered her messages now, the ones he had ignored. The emails he had never opened. The voicemails he had deleted without listening because he had been afraid of what they might ask from him. Sometime after midnight, a soft knock broke the silence of the apartment. Ethan froze. For a brief, irrational moment, he thought it might be Emma standing on the other side of the door, alive and angry and real. Instead, when he opened it, he found his legal advisor, pale and visibly shaken. The children, the man said carefully. Social services contacted us. They don't have a legal guardian. Ethan closed his eyes. The truth was no longer something he could debate or deny. It had a shape now, names, faces, and consequences. Somewhere in the city, 3 little girls were alone, grieving a mother he had once loved, carrying a truth he had been too afraid to face. And for the first time in 10 years, Ethan Harper understood that success had not saved him from the past. It had only delayed the moment when it would finally demand to be answered. The office where Ethan had signed billion-dollar contracts felt smaller than ever as he sat across from the social worker, his lawyers, and a court-appointed counselor. The walls of glass that once symbolized transparency and power now made him feel exposed, as if every mistake of his past were etched into them. On the table between them lay a thin folder containing documents that somehow weighed more than any financial report he had ever reviewed. The DNA results were clear. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation, no legal language to soften the truth. Olivia Harper. Lily Harper. Sophie Harper. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. Ethan stared at the names until the letters blurred, a strange mixture of disbelief and certainty twisting in his chest. This was not a rumor, not an accusation, not a nightmare he could wake up from. This was his life, rearranged without his permission. "You are their biological father," the counselor said gently, watching his reaction. "But legally, they are considered wards of the state until custody is determined." Ethan nodded, though his thoughts were far away. He was remembering birthdays he had never attended, scraped knees he had never kissed better, bedtime stories that had been read by someone else or perhaps not read at all. 6 years of absence suddenly felt heavier than all the years of work that had built his empire. When the meeting ended, he didn't return to the boardroom or his private office. Instead, he walked down a quiet hallway and locked himself into a small conference room no one ever used anymore. He sat alone at the long table, his elbows resting on the polished surface, and for the first time in years, his control shattered. The tears came silently at first, then uncontrollably, grief and regret spilling out without resistance. No press release had prepared him for this. No strategy could undo it. Later that afternoon, he visited the temporary foster facility where the girls were staying. The building was clean but impersonal, painted in cheerful colors that couldn't hide the sadness beneath them. When the door opened, Olivia, Lily, and Sophie stood together again, as if the world required them to remain united at all times. They recognized him instantly. Olivia's eyes lit up with cautious relief, Lily studied him as if memorizing every detail, and Sophie stayed half a step behind the others, gripping her sister's hand. "I signed the papers," Ethan said quietly, lowering himself to their level. "You can stay with me. For now." There was no excitement in their faces, only uncertainty. Sophie finally spoke, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "Are you going to leave us too?" The question cut deeper than any accusation. Ethan felt it settle in his chest, heavy and sharp, because he had no perfect answer to give. He could promise safety, money, comfort, but trust was something he hadn't earned. "No," he said, his voice rough but steady. "I won't. Not again." The girls exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them, and then Lily nodded once, as if accepting a temporary truce with fate. That night, Ethan prepared the guest rooms himself, refusing the help of his staff. He stood in the doorway long after the girls had fallen asleep, listening to the soft rhythm of their breathing, overwhelmed by the fragile reality of their presence. His penthouse no longer felt empty, but it didn't feel like home either. It felt like a second chance that could be taken away at any moment. As he turned off the lights and closed the door, Ethan understood something with terrifying clarity. Being their father was not a title confirmed by a test or a court document. It was a promise he would have to keep every single day, knowing that one broken word could hurt them more than his absence ever had. Ethan did not sleep that night. After the girls were settled with a temporary caregiver in the apartment, he sat at his desk as dawn crept slowly through the windows, surrounded by silence and unanswered questions. Knowing they were safe under his roof did nothing to ease the ache in his chest. If anything, it made the absence of their mother more real, more unbearable. He realized that before he could move forward with them, he needed to understand what had happened to Emma, not as a headline or a memory, but as the truth she had lived with alone. The next morning, he instructed his legal team to obtain her medical records and contact the hospital listed in the obituary. He expected resistance, bureaucracy, delays, but the process was disturbingly simple. Emma had no spouse, no listed partner, and no one powerful enough to shield her history. By the afternoon, Ethan found himself sitting in a quiet consultation room across from an oncologist who looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. "Stage 4, the doctor said carefully, folding his hands. "By the time we diagnosed it, treatment would have been aggressive and uncertain." Ethan stared at the floor, listening to details he wished he could erase. Chemotherapy. Pain. months of weakness that she had hidden while raising 3 children on her own. She was offered assistance, the doctor continued. Private charities, hospital programs. She declined all of it. Ethan looked up sharply. Why? The doctor hesitated before answering. She said she didn't want anyone contacting you on her behalf. She was very clear about that. The words settled heavily between them. Ethan thanked the doctor, though he wasn't sure why, and left the hospital feeling as if every step pulled him deeper into something irreversible. Emma had been dying, and she had still chosen silence over help, pride over survival, protecting him even when he didn't deserve it. That evening, he visited the small apartment where Emma had lived. It was modest, cramped, filled with signs of careful budgeting and quiet love. Children's drawings covered the refrigerator, shoes were neatly lined by the door, and the air still carried the faint scent of laundry detergent and something floral. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused. A social worker handed him a box labeled simply with her name. Personal belongings, she said. She asked that these be given to you if you were ever found. His hands shook as he opened it later, sitting alone on the floor. Inside were folded letters he had never read, photographs he had never taken, and at the very bottom, a worn notebook with softened edges. Her diary. He hesitated before opening it, knowing that once he did, there would be no distance left between them. The pages were filled with careful handwriting, sometimes neat, sometimes rushed, chronicling exhaustion, fear, and determination. She wrote about the girls' first smiles, their first steps, the nights she cried quietly in the bathroom so they wouldn't hear. And she wrote about him. Not with bitterness. Not with anger. She wrote about missing him, about hoping he was safe, about telling the girls stories of a father who was strong and kind, even when she didn't know if he still remembered her. Near the end, the handwriting weakened. If you ever read this, one entry said, please don't feel guilty. Loving you was never a mistake. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to be the reason you came back out of obligation. I wanted you to choose happiness, even if it wasn't with me. Ethan closed the notebook, his vision blurred with tears he no longer tried to hide. He stood abruptly and crossed the room to the mirror, staring at the man reflected back at him, a man who had built everything except the one thing that mattered. He raised his fist and struck the glass. The sound echoed sharply through the apartment, a clean crack splitting his reflection down the middle. Blood ran from his knuckles, but he didn't feel it. All he felt was the unbearable truth that Emma had carried her pain alone, believing he was better off without knowing. That night, when he returned home, Ethan stood quietly in the doorway of the girls' room. They were asleep, tangled in blankets, breathing softly, unaware of the storm of guilt and love reshaping their father's heart. He understood then that learning the truth about Emma was not the end of his grief, but the beginning of a promise he could never break. Time passed unevenly after Emma's truth came to light, moving too fast on some days and painfully slow on others. Ethan tried to build routines for the girls, believing structure might make the unfamiliar feel safer. Mornings became quieter, breakfasts slightly chaotic, evenings filled with hesitant conversations and carefully chosen words. He attended meetings remotely, turned down invitations, and learned the small but terrifying responsibility of being needed. The girls watched him closely, measuring his consistency in the way children do, not with questions but with silence. 3 months later, on an ordinary afternoon that promised nothing unusual, everything broke. It was raining lightly, the kind of rain that makes roads slick without warning. The girls were in the back seat of the car, arguing softly about which movie to watch later, while Ethan sat beside the driver, reviewing messages on his phone. The impact came suddenly, metal screaming against metal, the world jolting violently out of alignment. The sound was sharp and final, followed by a moment of impossible stillness. When Ethan opened his eyes, his first thought was not pain or fear but their names, repeating in his mind like a prayer. Olivia. Lily. Sophie. Paramedics moved quickly, voices overlapping, hands steady and practiced. The girls were conscious, crying, calling for him. Ethan answered them over and over, telling them he was there, that everything would be okay, even as dread coiled tightly in his chest. At the hospital, time dissolved into white hallways and harsh lights. Doctors spoke in measured tones, careful not to promise anything too soon. Lily and Sophie had bruises and cuts, nothing life-threatening. Olivia did not wake up. She has a severe head injury, the doctor said quietly. We've done everything we can for now. The word coma echoed in Ethan's mind, hollow and unreal. He sat beside Olivia's bed as machines breathed and beeped around her, the smallness of her hand in his overwhelming him. Her face was pale, too still, stripped of the quiet strength she usually carried. He watched her chest rise and fall, terrified that if he looked away, it might stop. Lily and Sophie were taken home later that night by a caregiver, confused and frightened, asking questions Ethan could not answer. He stayed behind, refusing to leave Olivia, sleeping in a chair, his suit wrinkled and forgotten. Hours turned into days. Days into endless waiting. Ethan spoke to her constantly, telling her about Emma, about the stories her mother had written down, about the life they could still have if she stayed. He apologized aloud for things she might never hear, for every moment he had missed, for every promise he had broken before she ever knew his name. At night, when the ward grew quiet, fear pressed in on him more heavily. He imagined explaining loss to two children who had already buried their mother. He imagined their faces hardening, trust dissolving. The thought hollowed him out. For the first time in his life, Ethan prayed without pride or expectation. He prayed in broken sentences, offering anything he could think of in exchange for her waking. He promised change, humility, devotion, knowing none of it could be bargained, yet unable to stop. One evening, as rain streaked down the hospital windows again, he felt the weight of exhaustion finally pull at him. He rested his forehead against Olivia's hand, his voice barely audible. "I just found you," he whispered. "Please don't leave me now." The machines continued their steady rhythm, indifferent to his desperation. Ethan stayed where he was, holding on, realizing with painful clarity that this was the moment his strength, his wealth, and his control meant nothing at all. The doctors warned him not to expect miracles, yet Ethan continued to return to the hospital each morning with the same quiet hope he tried to hide from everyone else. Days blended together in a haze of antiseptic smells, muted conversations, and the soft beeping of machines that had become the background rhythm of his life. Lily and Sophie visited when they could, standing on either side of Olivia's bed, speaking to her in whispers as if raising their voices might break something fragile and unseen. 2 weeks passed without change. Then, on a morning that began no differently from the others, everything shifted. Ethan was seated beside the bed, reading aloud from Emma's diary, choosing the gentler entries, the ones filled with warmth and small victories. His voice was low and steady, though his hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. When he reached the end of a paragraph, he felt a faint pressure against his fingers. He froze. At first, he thought it was his imagination, another trick of desperate hope, but then he felt it again. Olivia's fingers moved, barely, but undeniably real. "Olivia," he whispered, leaning forward. "I'm here." Her eyelashes fluttered, casting shadows against her pale skin. The room seemed to hold its breath. Slowly, with visible effort, her eyes opened, unfocused at first, then settling on his face as if trying to understand what she was seeing. "Daddy," she whispered. The word shattered him. Ethan let out a sound that was half laughter, half sob, gripping her hand as tears spilled freely down his face. Nurses rushed in, voices urgent but controlled, checking monitors, calling for the doctor. None of it mattered. She was awake. She was here. Lily and Sophie arrived later that day, bursting into the room with cautious excitement that quickly dissolved into tears when they saw Olivia conscious and smiling weakly at them. The three girls held hands, their fingers intertwined, a quiet, powerful circle of survival. That same evening, Ethan made decisions that would have once terrified him. He called his board, cancelled meetings, and authorized the sale of a significant portion of his company shares. When his advisors questioned him, he answered calmly, without explanation. For the first time, his choices were not driven by fear of loss but by clarity. He founded a charitable foundation in Emma Wilson's name within days, directing its mission toward supporting single mothers and children facing cancer, ensuring that no one would ever have to choose silence over survival again. It was not an attempt at redemption. It was a promise made tangible. When Olivia was finally discharged weeks later, the apartment no longer felt temporary. Ethan rearranged his life around the girls without resentment or hesitation. He learned how to tie hair ribbons, how to listen without interrupting, how to sit on the floor during movie nights even when his back protested. Late one night, long after the girls had fallen asleep, Ethan stood alone on the balcony, the city lights stretching endlessly below. He thought of Emma, of her quiet strength, of the love she had carried without recognition. He whispered her name into the night, not as an apology but as a vow. He had stopped running. For the first time in his life, Ethan understood that miracles were not sudden or loud. Sometimes they arrived in the soft opening of a child's eyes and the quiet certainty that from this moment on, he would never let go. The calm that followed Olivia's recovery did not last long. It never does when truth collides with the public eye. It began quietly, with a single leaked court document, then a photograph taken through the tinted window of Ethan's car as he helped the girls inside. By the end of the week, the story was everywhere, reshaped and sharpened by headlines that stripped it of nuance and mercy. A powerful CEO. 3 secret children. A dead woman left behind. Ethan watched the news in silence as Lily and Sophie played on the floor nearby, carefully shielding them from the screen with his body whenever he could. The words felt unreal, as if they belonged to someone else, yet every accusation landed with precision. Commentators speculated about motives, timelines, morality. They spoke of Emma as a footnote and of the girls as a scandal. The board of directors reacted swiftly. An emergency meeting was called, and for the first time since he had founded the company, Ethan entered the boardroom knowing the outcome might not be in his favor. The familiar table, once a symbol of control and authority, felt cold and distant. Faces he had trusted for years looked at him now with calculation rather than respect. "This situation damages the company's image," one of them said bluntly. "Your personal life has become a liability." Ethan listened without interrupting, his hands folded calmly in front of him. He had expected this. He had prepared for it in the quiet moments beside hospital beds and during sleepless nights on the couch outside his daughter's room. They asked him to step down. Temporarily, they said. For the good of the company. When it was his turn to speak, his voice was steady, lacking the sharp edge he once used to dominate negotiations. "I won't," he said. "And I won't pretend my daughters are a mistake to be hidden." The room fell silent. He explained his decision clearly, without defensiveness or apology. He would not separate his life into acceptable and inconvenient parts. He would not choose profit over people again. If the company required that kind of sacrifice, then it was no longer aligned with the man he had become. The vote passed without him. By the time he left the building, his resignation was already public. His net worth dropped dramatically within hours as markets reacted, numbers falling in ways that would have once terrified him. Now, they barely registered. What did register was Sophie's expression that evening when she overheard a fragment of conversation between two adults. "Is it our fault?" she asked quietly, her voice heavy with fear she tried to hide. Ethan knelt in front of her immediately, taking her small hands in his. "No," he said firmly. "Never. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." Lily watched him carefully, her gaze sharper, older than her years. "You're not mad at us?" He shook his head, pulling all three girls into his arms, feeling their warmth, their reality. "I chose you," he said. "Every single time, I will choose you." The following weeks were difficult. The apartment was quieter, stripped of staff and excess. Some friends disappeared. Invitations stopped coming. Yet something unexpected happened in the space left behind. The girls laughed more freely. Meals became messier. Evenings stretched longer without interruptions. One afternoon, as they worked on homework at the kitchen table, Olivia looked up and smiled. "You're different now," she said. Ethan paused. "Is that a bad thing?" She shook her head. "No. You're here." The simplicity of the statement struck him harder than any headline. In losing the version of himself the world admired, he had gained something far more fragile and far more important. For the first time, Ethan Harper understood that love was not proven by success or sacrifice alone, but by staying when leaving would be easier. 5 years passed quietly, not in the way success is loud and visible, but in the steady rhythm of days that slowly knit themselves into a life. The house by the ocean was nothing like the penthouse Ethan once lived in. It was smaller, warmer, filled with light and the constant sound of movement. Windows were left open to the sea air, shoes were abandoned near the door, and laughter carried easily from room to room. The girls had grown taller, stronger, more certain of themselves. Olivia had lost her fear of hospitals and learned how to swim before she learned how to be afraid of the waves. Lily developed a habit of asking difficult questions, the kind that required thought rather than quick answers, while Sophie remained observant and gentle, expressing herself through drawings that covered the refrigerator in color. They argued, reconciled, and moved through life with the unspoken confidence of children who knew they were not alone. Ethan watched them from the porch as they ran along the beach, their voices blending with the sound of the ocean. They called for him, waving with sand-covered hands, and he answered without hesitation, rising to join them instead of watching from a distance. He no longer measured time in meetings or markets, but in sunsets and shared meals, in stories told before bed and mornings that began slowly. Inside the house, a framed photograph stood on the mantel. Emma smiled out from it, young and alive, her presence woven into the home not as a shadow but as a quiet companion. Fresh flowers sat beside the frame, replaced every week without reminder. Ethan spoke to her sometimes, not out of guilt, but out of gratitude for the love she had given their daughters and the strength she had shown when no one was there to witness it. The foundation bearing her name had grown beyond his expectations. What began as a promise became a network of support, reaching women and children who once stood where Emma had stood, alone and unseen. Ethan rarely spoke publicly about it. The work mattered more than recognition. That evening, after the sun dipped below the horizon and the girls collapsed onto the couch, tired and happy, Lily grew quiet. She glanced toward the photograph on the mantel, then back at Ethan. "Do you think Mom knows we're happy?" she asked. Ethan considered the question carefully before answering. He had learned not to rush moments like this. "I think she always knew," he said softly. "And I think she would be proud of you." Sophie leaned her head against his shoulder, while Olivia smiled, her hand resting over his, strong and warm. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing through the open windows and stirring the curtains gently, as if the house itself were breathing. Later that night, long after the girls had gone to bed, Ethan stood alone by the shoreline. The moonlight reflected on the water, steady and unbroken. He thought of the man he had been, driven by fear and ambition, and of the man he had become through loss, love, and responsibility. The path between them had been painful, but it had led him here. For the first time, there was no sense of something missing. Ethan turned back toward the house, its lights glowing softly against the darkness, and felt a quiet certainty settle within him. The past had shaped him, but it no longer owned him. What remained was not regret, but a future built on presence, devotion, and a love that had finally learned how to stay.